The remaster for Horizon Zero Dawn has been a bit controversial when I've looked at the kind of comments on it online and all of that, given I think some people are like, really, does this game actually need to develop a remastered version? The original version already looks really good. Well, the remaster does look better. Digital Foundry has got an early look at this before the full release on October 31st, about a week from today's video. And you can see there are some pretty considerable upgrades to the environmental detail. There's a bunch of other upgrades as well. I'll link their video in the video description if you want to look at more of what are the actual visual changes for the remaster. But when you're getting these visual upgrades, these are also going to come at a performance cost. So today, I was really interested to see that Nixies, who is developing this remaster, have published the official PC system requirements. Now, there's a lot of stuff I noticed about this. First of all, let's note the fact that it is Nixies doing this remaster, which is interesting because generally they're not known for doing remasters, they're known for doing the PC ports of PlayStation 5 exclusive games. So this is kind of a new thing for Sony to be using them to do. That also means that Guerrilla Games, who actually makes the Horizon games, weren't the ones using up their development resources on this remaster. So that's good if you're worried about it like impacting how long it would take to get the next actual Horizon game. And it does look like this game is a $10 upgrade to get the remaster if you already own the original. But again, even if that alleviates some of the concerns around this, there is still the question about the performance cost. So when I looked at these system requirements, I wanted to do two things. Number one, compare it to the performance of the original game without the remaster. But also compare it to Horizon Forbidden West, the sequel, which, interestingly enough, was, the PC port at least was developed by Nixies, and the whole point of this remaster of Zero Dawn is more to use some of the technology from that sequel game and bring it into the original Zero Dawn and kind of get them sort of up to par. So one of the most interesting things I noticed when I saw this system requirements list for Zero Dawn is I was like having this weird sense of deja vu to the point where I was like double checking, wait, this does say Zero Dawn, right? Because it almost felt like somebody published the wrong graph, because if you check this is the system requirement post for Forbidden West, the sequel. And if you look at it, it's the same thing. Like it's literally exactly the same other than the storage space. It's the same CPUs, it's the same GPUs for the same 720p 30 very low, 1080p 60 medium. It's the same chart. So, in other words, if you've played Horizon Forbidden West on PC, then they're just giving you exactly the same performance claims here. So you should, I guess, already know how it runs, assuming that this system requirement chart, means anything if it's accurate, right? That's always one question with system requirements charts. But then the other thing to compare it to is the non-remastered version, right? So the original just Horizon Zero Dawn Complete Edition. Now, that version of the game never got this extensive type of PC system requirements. It was the simpler minimum recommended, didn't ever say, what resolution and frame rate that was targeting, what graphic settings, any of that. And the biggest thing I'll say that I note when comparing the minimum specs of the non-remastered version is that the CPUs for the non-remastered version are much, much, much lower than what we're seeing on this remaster. Now, whether that ends up actually being necessary or whether these were just the minimum CPUs that Nixies bothered to test with at this point on a newer game, right? We're into newer features, in newer hardware. It's been years since the, original one came out. So there is that question, right? So again, is this really the minimum, or could you still get by on those older CPUs? But I would say If you have the original version and you're wondering, should I get this remastered version, but you have like a way older CPU, that would maybe be a bit of a question mark in my mind on that decision. The other thing I was looking at was the minimum GPUs, again, for just for 720p 30, very low. And now they're asking for a 1650 or an RX 5500 XT, and they are mentioning at least 4 gigabytes of VRAM on both of those. And if you look at the non-remastered version minimum system requirements, they were just asking for a GTX 780 3 gigabyte or an AMD Radeon R9 290 4 gigabyte. So there's that 3 gigabyte versus now they're asking for 4 gigabytes on both GPUs. There's also the GTX 780. And if I go to like a relative performance chart, like at Tech Power Up, and pull up the 3 gigabyte GTX 780 and go here to relative performance, and we can get the idea that actually the 1650 is not much more powerful than a GTX 780. Tech Power Up has them within 4% of each other. Now, I know sometimes on the older GPUs, there's some questions on do they support newer like DX12 feature sets, where perhaps that could have been the difference because perhaps this newer upgrade maybe had some additional requirements regarding that, like the feature set rather than just overall power and performance. So that's something to note. Also, the other thing I wanted to get into is, okay, so how did the original game perform, right? If we wanted to compare it to that. So I never actually tested the original non-remastered version on a GTX 780 or an R9 290 because I don't have either of those GPUs. However, the original recommended specs was a GTX 1060 or an RX 580 from AMD. And I actually did test out the original game on that hardware using the built-in benchmark that the original game shipped with. It had a built-in benchmark run. So the recommended GPU was a GTX 1060. And notice that now the recommended GPU is moving up to a RTX 3060, which is significantly more powerful. Although now they're mentioning that's to target medium settings at 1080p 60. And again, the medium settings now are probably more than what the medium settings were in the non-remastered version, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at this a little bit. So if I pull up my testing on the GTX 1060 at medium settings at 1080p, I've got this video footage we can kind of scroll through here. If you set the game, again, the non-remastered version of the game to the original preset, which is basically what the PS4 version of the game looked like, that was the medium settings at 1080p. And then if you go ahead and run the built-in benchmark run, once you actually get into the city area, it was definitely not locking 60 FPS. Now, it wasn't worlds off of 60 FPS, but it would often dip into the mid to lower 50s and could even drop into the 40s at times. Now, not to say it couldn't hit 60, but you were definitely not getting a totally locked 60 FPS at 1080p medium in the original game. Now, the recommended GPU in the original game on the GTX 1060, if you go down to low settings, does hold a more locked 60 FPS and above with occasional dips back in the original game. So you could play the game at 1080p 60, at least on low settings, and dip a bit below 60 at the medium settings. The ultra settings were a bit too much. You would be down in the 40s quite frequently on that 1060 in the original game. So if it ends up being true that you need to step all the way up to an RTX 3060 in order to play at 1080p 60 medium, that would be a considerable additional performance ask from this game. For example, if we go back up to the Tech Power Up relative performance chart, and we set that 1060 as the 100% baseline, and then look at how powerful an RTX 3060 is relative to that, it is asking for considerably more performance. The RTX 3060 is sitting here at about 84% more powerful than a GTX 1060, according to Tech Power Up's relative performance chart. And again, that can vary in different games and all that. But it looks like, yeah, the medium settings are going to be a lot more demanding, but they'll probably also look a lot better than the medium settings used to look. So you've got that kind of trade-off there, right? Another way we could look at this is instead of looking at the 1060 in the old game, We could look at the 3060 in the old game. So if a 3060 is now going to be getting you 1080p 60 at medium, what did a 3060 get you previously before this update? So I do have a RTX 3060 tested out in this game at 1080p ultra settings. And if you do want me to scroll back, I can show you. So this is the 1080p resolution. This is the ultra settings in the, again, original non-remastered version of the game. And if we go through the built-in benchmark run, you can see that we're often up in the 90 FPS range. So you used to be able to max out the game at around 90 FPS or so on a 3060, oftentimes over 100 FPS, depends on what's happening in the scene. But it's looking like with these new updates, the medium settings will be closer to 60 FPS. So, but again, will the new medium setting look better than the old ultra setting? That's actually possible, right? Because of these updates. Also, another thing I thought would be kind of interesting to look at is that the we could go ahead and look at the 3060 in another light, which is you actually used to be able to use the RTX 3060 to play at 4K Ultra with DLSS quality and not be at ridiculously bad performance. It's not quite a locked 60, but here we can see DLSS quality at 4K rendering resolution at Ultra settings in the old non-remastered version of the game. And, we're hanging out in the, 50 FPS range. Sure, it's not a locked 60, but that 3060 could push some higher resolutions here. The game wasn't too crazy demanding. I can skip around in the benchmark. And again, we're often in the mid 50 FPS range. Again, in the new game, it's looking like if you're looking at 4K 60, again, no mention of DLSS, but 4K 60, now they're asking something like a 4080 or a 7900 XT. So, considerably more demanding on those settings. But again, these do seem to be lining up with what they were asking for the Forbidden West, the sequel type game. Looks like the same type of chart. The other thing about the Forbidden West system requirements was that to actually lock to 60 FPS on a lot of these, it was relying on a dynamic resolution feature for Forbidden West, and that wasn't stated with the system requirements. So I'm also somewhat suspicious that that would be also the case for this remastered list of system requirements. Anyway, so if we want to get into some more of the details, like I said, one thing that I had noted was that the CPUs did appear to be a bit of a step up compared to what the original game was asking for. So now the minimum that it's asking for even 30 FPS is a Core i3-8100 or a Ryzen 3 1300X, as opposed to the old game only asking for an i5 2500K or an FX 6300. So that's considerably newer CPUs. Again, whether or not that's actually needed, well, we'll have to find out. An i3-8100 is a 4-core, 4-thread processor from 2017, so it's still quite old and fairly low-end, but it is a lot newer than the original game was asking for. The Ryzen 3 1300X being 4-core, 4-thread from 2017. And again, now they're kind of stepping up to get 60 FPS at medium settings, an i5 8600 or a Ryzen 5 3600, so nothing too crazy on those. The i5 8600 being 6-core, 6-thread chip from 2018, so kind of a mid-range chip from 6 years ago. And the Ryzen 5 3600, 6-core 12-thread from 2019, so a mid-range chip from about 5 years ago. Also, the Ryzen 5 3600 has about the same CPU performance as a PlayStation 5 generally does when gaming, so that's kind of what they're asking for there. Now, they do kind of, again, scale up from there, but what I will say is in most games, you don't actually need a more powerful CPU at higher resolutions and graphics settings, unless the graphics settings are adding in ray tracing or a lot more crowd density. And the resolution doesn't usually have a big impact on the CPU requirement. So I'm fairly doubtful whether we'd really need to step up to these unless we weren't actually hitting 60 FPS on these. But that's just kind of generally how I interpret that. Another thing is it's now asking for 16 gigabytes of RAM on the minimum settings, whereas the old game only asked for, only asked for 8 gigabytes of RAM minimum, but did ask you to go up to 16 gigabytes of RAM for the recommended. So not a massive change there unless you're looking at the absolute minimums. Also, the game used to take 100 gigabytes of storage space. Looks like now we're up to 135, so the additional detail and textures and all of that does take more storage space. And then with the GPUs, again, it's looking like for 720p 30 FPS at very low settings, we're now at like a 1650 RX 5500 XT type of GPU. That RTX 3060 we already looked at, or at AMD RX 5700. If you're looking for 1080p 60 at medium on the new types of graphics that they have available. If you're looking for 1440p 60 at high settings, they're suggesting an RTX 3070 or an RX 6800. We could look at the GPU performance chart to look at kind of where that goes. So if we're at our 3060 as a baseline, how much more powerful are we looking to jump up to that 1440p 60? Well, if we scroll up to the 3070, it's about 50% more powerful, and the 6800 is kind of in that same general ballpark, usually a bit more powerful and has more VRAM. But again, I'm also a little suspicious that they're going to rely on a bit of dynamic resolution scaling for this, because like I said, the system requirement chart for Forbidden West was kind of hiding the fact that it did. Anyway, and then the RTX 4080 or 7900 XT is the ask if you want to play at 4K 60 at very high settings. Again, potentially some dynamic resolution scaling there would be my guess, but that's not officially confirmed. So again, that's another big step up, but going up to 4K resolution is incredibly demanding on the graphics card. So if we were at an RTX 3070 playing at 1440p 60, and we wanted to scroll up to a 4080, that would be almost doubling the performance in order to do that. Now, the one thing that's kind of interesting here is the 7900 XT is generally weaker than a 4080. It's the XTX that generally kind of matches the 4080. So that's a bit of an interesting choice there. I did double check, and that's also the case for their Forbidden West chart that looks like it's just been copy and pasted. So anyway, that's just kind of interesting to note. But anyway, on that final note, that's sort of my final thoughts on all of this, is this really does look like they just copy and pasted the Forbidden West system requirements. Perhaps it's accurate, since they're trying to put the graphics roughly in line with Forbidden West. Or perhaps this indicates that this was a fairly lazy system requirement chart that may or may not actually mean anything. We'll have to find out when the game comes out on October 31st. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comment section. Is this one that I should bother to revisit for performance testing or anything? You could let me know, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.